Europeans are the descendants of at least three major migrations of prehistoric people. First, a group of hunter-gatherers arrived in Europe about 37,000 years ago. Then, farmers began migrating from Anatolia, a region including present-day Turkey, into Europe 9,000 years ago. But they initially didn't intermingle much with the local hunter-gatherers because they brought their own families with them. Finally, 5,000 years ago, nomadic herders known as the Yamnaya swept into Europe. They were an early Bronze Age culture that came from the grasslands or steppes of modern-day Russia and Ukraine, bringing with them metallurgy and animal herding skills and possibly Proto-Indo-European, the mysterious ancestral tongue from which all of today's 400 Indo-European languages spring. They immediately interbred with local Europeans who were the descendants of both the farmers and hunter-gatherers. Within a few hundred years, the Amnaya contributed to at least half of Central Europeans' genetic ancestry. The finding that Yamnaya men migrated for many generations also suggests that all was not right back home in the steppe. It would simply imply a continuing, strongly negative push factor within the steppes, such as chronic epidemics or disease, says archaeologist David Anthony of Hartwick College in New York. Or he says it could be the beginning of cultures that sent out bands of men to establish new politically aligned colonies in distant lands, as in later groups of Romans or Vikings. In the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, people associated with what archaeologists referred to as the Amnaya Horizon, essentially a pastoralist Kurgan culture developed out of eastern origins in the steppes of the Don and Volga River regions. The herding people or societies of this culture were most likely speakers of classic Proto-Indo-European, and were the first in the Eurasian steppes to generate a pastoral economy requiring regular seasonal migrations to fresh grazing land. They used wagons pulled by cattle to carry their tents and supplies far into the steppes of Central Asia when necessary to graze their animals. They also used horses to survey huge amounts of territory and to drive their large herds of domesticated animals. People associated with the Yamnaya herding culture spread swiftly across the steppes carrying cannabis and its use with them, eventually broadening their range to include areas to the west in the Danube Valley and then into other areas of Eastern Europe, including Serbia and Hungary, where they encountered settled farmers. Even if the idea that the Yamnaya people were using hemp for fiber is speculative at this point, there is evidence that they and other contemporary people in the regions used cannabis for ceremonial purposes. Indeed, a major characteristic of the Amnaya cultural horizon was their funeral ritual and how this is manifested in their kurgans. For example, in Eastern Europe, there are two sites that have yielded hemp seeds more than 4,000 years old. One is the grave at Gurbanești, east of Bucharest in the Danube Valley region of Romania, where a clay vessel, or pipe cup, with carbonized hemp seeds was discovered. This is perhaps the earliest evidence for the burning of cannabis that exists. Central Eurasia's Yamnaya people, thought to be one of the three key tribes that founded European civilization, dispersed eastwards at this time and are thought to have spread cannabis and possibly psychoactive use throughout Eurasia. The pollen, fruit, and fibers of cannabis have been turning up in Eurasian archaeological digs for decades. It is often assumed that cannabis was first used and possibly domesticated somewhere in China or Central Asia, the researchers say, but their database points to an alternative. Some of the most recent studies included in the database suggest that the herb entered the archaeological record of Japan and Eastern Europe at almost exactly the same time, 11,000 years ago. The cannabis plant seems to have been distributed widely from as early as 10,000 years ago or even earlier. Early evidence for cannabis reported from both Frumușica and Gurbanești, two sites located in Romania, which is home of Dăinescu, is probably associated with the ancient Yamnaya cultures. Its name derives from its characteristic burial traditions. Yamnaya is a Russian adjective that means related to pits, yama, and these people used to bury their dead into muli, kurgans, containing simple pit chambers. The people of the Yamnaya culture were likely the result of a genetic admixture between the descendants of Eastern European hunter-gatherers and people related to hunter-gatherers from the Caucasus. They lived primarily as nomads, with a chiefdom system and wheeled carts and wagons that allowed them to manage large herds. They are also closely connected to final Neolithic cultures, which later spread throughout Europe and Central Asia. The Yamnaya contribution in the modern populations of Eastern Europe ranges from 46.8% among Russians to 42.8% in Ukrainians. Finland has one of the highest Yamnaya contributions in all of Europe, 50.4%. The people represented by this culture spread rapidly across greater northern Europe, all the way from Ukraine to Belgium.